The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom creaked as he stepped inside, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. The air was thick with a silence that carried both authority and judgment, yet beneath it, a current of hostility was waiting to emerge. He walked in with his shoulders squared and head held high, every movement deliberate, every gesture a declaration of dignity. He had faced harsher battles before, both on the field and in life, so the courtroom should have been no different. But almost instantly, before a single word was spoken, eyes darted toward him with a suspicion that was not extended to anyone else in the room. It wasn't about his case, it wasn't about his record, it was about the color of his skin. That was enough for the glances to sharpen, the whispers to rise, and the doubt to settle in the atmosphere like smoke. He adjusted his jacket, not out of nervousness, but as a way of grounding himself, as though reminding the room that he was not there to be diminished. Yet the courtroom's reception was cold. Some of the jurors shifted in their seats, their gazes sliding over him with a quiet disdain, while the officials' expressions tightened, preparing for questions that would test not his character, but his very right to stand there with confidence. He knew this look. He had seen it before, in airports, in boardrooms, in the sideways glances of strangers who thought themselves subtle but revealed everything with a fleeting smirk or a too long stare. The courtroom was no different. Here, prejudice wore the mask of procedure. The judge glanced at him briefly, almost skeptically, as though trying to reconcile the man before him with the accusations swirling in whispers. His presence didn't match the image that prejudice had painted in their minds. He stood tall, educated, articulate, and every inch of him exuded a discipline that could not be faked. Yet instead of admiration, the room bristled with unease. They questioned his belonging, as though a black man entering a courtroom with poise had to prove he deserved to breathe the same air as those who doubted him. As he took his seat, he caught sight of the prosecution exchanging smirks. Their eyes were not on the evidence, not on the facts, but on him, as though his skin had already signed a confession. He could almost hear the unspoken words beneath their mocking glances. What is he doing here? Does he think he can outsmart us? Does he think he belongs? It wasn't just about the case, it was about identity, about the audacity of a man of color carrying himself with unshaken assurance in a place where they wanted him small. He remembered the stories his grandfather once told him about walking into rooms where no one wanted him, about being judged before he spoke, about having to fight not just for justice, but for the basic recognition of humanity. Those stories weren't history, they were present, alive in this very moment, repeating themselves in the polished chamber of the courtroom. The weight of generations pressed against him, but he bore it not with fear, but with resolve. Every question they threw at him was laced with an undertone, every word wrapped in suspicion. When they asked about his background, it wasn't curiosity, it was an accusation masked as inquiry. When they pressed about his associations, it wasn't about truth, it was about finding cracks where none existed. And when they scrutinized his achievements, it wasn't admiration, it was disbelief, as though success should be foreign to someone like him. The courtroom was not just a legal arena, it was a stage where bias played its cruelest role. Yet through it all, he didn't flinch. He didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. His silence between their questions carried more power than their words, his calm posture more commanding than their smirks. In that room, his very existence as a man of dignity was an act of defiance. The prejudice around him tried to shrink him, but with every breath he took, he reminded them he could not be reduced. The gavel had not yet fallen, but the trial had already begun, not of him, but of the room itself, of its willingness to confront the bias it carried so openly. The first round of questioning began with an almost casual tone, but it was laced with something sharp, something meant to wound rather than to reveal truth. The official leaned forward, his voice slow and deliberate, as though every syllable carried the weight of authority. Yet beneath that calm exterior was mockery, an attempt to chip away at the man sitting before them. He was not being asked questions to establish facts, he was being tested, like someone who had wandered into a space where he did not belong. The courtroom was supposed to be a place of impartiality, yet each inquiry dripped with suspicion, as though they were less interested in answers and more intent on exposing cracks in his very identity. They asked where he came from, but it wasn't about geography, it was about roots, about suggesting that his background was questionable, that it carried shadows others did not bear. His response was steady, his tone unshaken, but he could hear the subtle scoffs, the tiny chuckles exchanged between the officials who found humor in doubting him. They pressed about his qualifications, questioning his achievements not with genuine curiosity but with disbelief. It was the disbelief of those who struggled to imagine that a man like him could have walked halls of power, could have commanded respect, could have built a reputation strong enough to stand on its own. To them, his resume was less a list of accomplishments and more a collection of claims they refused to take seriously. When he spoke of his service, their expressions didn't shift toward respect, but skepticism. The man who questioned him tilted his head, almost smirking, as if the idea of someone like him having held responsibility and authority was a story too far-fetched. The courtroom that should have echoed with dignity instead resonated with quiet derision. They weren't just interrogating him, they were mocking the idea of his worth. His words, calm and measured, seemed to clash with the tone they wanted from him. They wanted defensiveness, anger, an outburst that would confirm their doubts. But he gave them none of it. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk, pretending to take notes while really just displaying impatience. "Are you sure about that?" he asked after every answer, not because he doubted the truth, but because he doubted the man delivering it. Every "are you sure" was an echo of the prejudice that had been cast on him the moment he walked through those doors. It was a tactic, a way to remind him that in their eyes, his words required more proof than anyone else's. His truth was never enough, it had to be dragged across the floor, weighed down with scrutiny that others would never face. He noticed how the questions shifted from the case at hand to him personally. His upbringing, his education, his associations, all of it was dragged into the light as though he were the one on trial, as though his character alone determined guilt or innocence. They tried to unravel him piece by piece, stripping away dignity through innuendo, twisting his history into something suspect. The courtroom began to feel less like a search for justice and more like a performance of power, where they enjoyed watching a man forced to defend his very existence. He kept his composure, but inside, he could sense the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about him, this was about every man who had ever been doubted because of skin before skill, color before character. Each question wasn't just for him to answer, it was for every silent listener in that room who carried the same scars of being dismissed, overlooked, underestimated. He knew his answers mattered beyond the moment, they were a testament to resilience, a refusal to bow beneath their prejudice. One official asked about his leadership experience, his voice dripping with irony, as though leadership was a quality reserved for others. The room chuckled quietly when the question was framed in a way that made his achievements sound exaggerated. But when he responded, listing his commands, his responsibilities, the weight he had carried with steady hands, the laughter faded into murmurs. They didn't want to believe it, but they couldn't deny it either. The tension in the room thickened, their smiles faltering as the truth pressed against their bias. Still, the disrespect did not stop. The more he proved himself, the more they tried to dig deeper, desperate to find flaws, desperate to discover something that would validate their doubts. Every time they questioned his background, they weren't seeking information, they were grasping for weakness. Yet every answer he gave came with a calmness that unsettled them. The strength of his composure was sharper than any blade, cutting through their condescension with quiet precision. He wasn't fighting with anger, he was dismantling their prejudice with the strength of truth. The questions became sharper, less veiled, and more openly hostile as the session dragged on. What had started as subtle undertones of doubt quickly evolved into outright disrespect, the kind that made no effort to hide its intent. The officials no longer masked their bias with polite phrasing or professional restraint. Instead, their words carried a bite, designed to remind him of the place they thought he should occupy. It was no longer about legal matters or facts, it had shifted into a spectacle, a display of power cloaked in procedure, and the target of their disdain was not his testimony but his very identity. One prosecutor leaned forward, his voice raised ever so slightly, the condescension in his tone unmistakable. He repeated questions he already knew the answers to, as though repetition would expose some hidden fault. Each time the man answered with composure, it only seemed to frustrate them more. They weren't looking for truth, they were searching for weakness, something they could use to justify the sneers already plastered on their faces. A chuckle rippled through the courtroom when one official rephrased a question with a mocking twist, as though the very idea of a black man holding authority was a punchline worth sharing. The laughter was quiet, but it was enough. It cut through the air, meant to belittle, meant to remind him that his worth was still under their judgment. The jurors shifted in their seats, some uncomfortable, some indifferent, others feeding on the performance unfolding before them. Every raised eyebrow, every skeptical glance was another stone thrown his way. The courtroom wasn't just observing anymore, it was participating. Whispers grew louder, no longer confined to hushed tones. Words like unbelievable and pretender drifted through the silence between questions, not shouted but spoken just loud enough to reach his ears. It was a chorus of doubt, a room deciding before the gavel struck that he was undeserving of their respect. He sat tall, refusing to let his body betray the sting of their words, but inside, he felt the weight of the injustice pressing against him. He knew the pattern well, how prejudice gained confidence when unchallenged, how it thrived when it sensed an audience that would indulge it. These weren't just questions, they were attacks dressed up in the language of authority. They stripped his answers of validity before he could even finish speaking, cutting him off, interjecting with smirks and sarcastic remarks. Each interruption was a statement, your voice does not carry the same weight here. The judge did little to stop the growing hostility. A raised hand here, a mild word of caution there, but nothing strong enough to shift the tone. The lack of intervention was permission, a silent endorsement of the prejudice unraveling in the chamber. It fueled the officials, emboldened them to push further, to turn the proceeding into a stage where bias could parade freely. They questioned his background with sneers, his accomplishments with disbelief, and his credibility with laughter. What should have been a test of facts had become a trial of identity, and the verdict had been written long before he walked through the door. Yet his composure remained intact. Each insult, each slight, each mocking question met the same steady tone, the same measured cadence. His refusal to bend under the pressure was not just self-control, it was defiance. In their eyes, his calmness was arrogance, and that only made them push harder. They wanted to provoke him, to force an outburst that would validate their prejudice, to see him lose control so they could point and say, see, he is exactly what we thought. But he denied them that satisfaction. His restraint was sharper than any retort, his discipline louder than any raised voice. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Some spectators leaned forward, waiting for him to crack, while others averted their gaze, uneasy at the open hostility but unwilling to speak against it. Every second stretched, the atmosphere thickening with the weight of unspoken truths. What was happening wasn't just questioning, it was humiliation dressed as inquiry, disrespect painted as formality. The man at the center of it all sat unshaken, carrying not only his own dignity but the unspoken dignity of countless others who had faced the same ridicule in rooms where justice was supposed to reign. The air in the courtroom had grown suffocating, thick with the weight of prejudice that clung to every question, every chuckle, every dismissive glance. They had pushed him, tried to strip him of dignity, tried to chip away at his composure with mockery disguised as inquiry. Yet he hadn't faltered, and that steadiness only seemed to irritate them more. The officials leaned in, relentless, searching for a crack. But then, with a calmness that caught the room off guard, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The motion was slow, deliberate, not an act of defiance but of certainty. It wasn't a distraction, it wasn't avoidance, it was the moment he had been waiting for. The officials smirked at first, exchanging glances, as though he had finally given them the mistake they were pressing for. "Do you think this is a game?" one of them scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But he didn't answer. His thumb hovered briefly over the screen before pressing a single button. The courtroom quieted, curiosity overtaking arrogance for the first time that day. The phone rang, the sound echoing through the chamber in sharp, steady tones. Each ring pulled the room tighter, dragging their confidence into silence. He sat perfectly still as the line connected. A voice answered, clear, authoritative, and instantly recognizable to those who knew the world beyond their narrow circle. It wasn't just any voice. It was a voice that carried weight, that commanded respect in halls much higher than this courtroom. Yes, General, I've been expecting your call, the voice said, calm but formal, reverberating through the hushed chamber. The title, General, landed in the room like thunder, shattering the smirks that had lingered seconds before. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The officials froze, their pens hanging useless in their hands, their eyes darting between him and the phone, as though they couldn't quite process what they had just heard. The courtroom, once buzzing with doubt, fell into a stunned silence. The weight of that single word overturned every assumption, every sneer, every mockery that had been thrown his way. The man they had questioned, doubted, belittled, wasn't just someone defending himself against prejudice. He was someone who had earned respect at the highest levels, someone whose authority and integrity were undeniable, someone whose phone call could reach voices they couldn't dream of standing beside. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke with the same calm, steady tone he had carried from the start. His conversation was brief, professional, the kind of exchange that spoke of familiarity, of trust, of equality with those at the top. The silence around him deepened, every ear straining to catch each word, every official realizing the trap they had built for him had collapsed under the weight of truth. When he ended the call, he placed the phone back on the table with quiet precision, his composure unbroken, his dignity untouchable. The looks on their faces told the story better than words could. The same officials who had laughed now sat rigid, their arrogance stripped away, their disbelief turning into discomfort. Some shifted in their seats, others avoided his eyes, and a few stared blankly, as though searching for a way to undo what had just been revealed. The courtroom had been a stage for prejudice, but with one phone call, the script had flipped entirely. They had tried to question him into smallness, but he had reminded them of a truth they could not erase: respect is not granted by those who doubt you, it is earned, and once earned, it cannot be taken away. The shift in the courtroom was immediate, almost physical, as if the very air had changed texture. Moments before, the space had been thick with derision, every sound laced with arrogance and prejudice, but now an uneasy silence hung over the room. It wasn't the calm of order, it was the silence of disbelief, of people realizing they had been caught standing on the wrong side of truth. The smirks had vanished, wiped away in an instant, replaced by tight lips and darting eyes. The officials who had leaned so confidently forward in their chairs now sat stiffly, their authority undercut by the weight of what they had just heard. It wasn't only shock that gripped them, it was embarrassment, the sudden awareness that their mockery had been dismantled not by an argument, but by a single undeniable fact revealed in a phone call. Whispers began to spread along the benches, faint at first, like wind brushing against dry leaves, but growing louder as they rippled through the audience. People leaned toward one another, muttering questions, repeating the word general as though testing its weight on their tongues. Some exchanged wide-eyed glances, others shook their heads in disbelief, while a few covered their mouths, hiding their astonishment. The atmosphere was no longer hostile but charged, thick with the uncomfortable energy of people realizing they had been complicit in prejudice. Those who had chuckled earlier now sat still, their laughter turned into shame. The prosecutor who had mocked him the most tapped his pen nervously against the desk, his earlier bravado completely gone. His eyes refused to meet the man's, instead focusing on his papers, as though words on a page could shield him from the humiliation spreading across the room. The official who had scoffed loudest shifted in his seat, his posture shrinking, his authority bleeding out of him with every second of silence. The same people who had been so loud in their disrespect could now barely bring themselves to breathe too heavily, their power broken not by confrontation but by revelation. The jurors, who had watched with varying degrees of skepticism, began to reassess the man sitting before them. Their gazes softened, their posture adjusted, and in their silence there was now an undercurrent of respect they had not offered before. They had been swept into the prejudice, but the truth had forced them to reconsider. The image of the man they had mocked had been shattered, replaced by the reality of who he truly was. Authority, honor, dignity, these were no longer just claims from his mouth, they were truths endorsed by voices beyond the courtroom, voices that no one could dare dismiss. Even the judge, who had allowed the earlier hostility to play out without intervention, sat differently now. His gavel rested quietly on the bench, untouched, as he looked down at the man with an expression that hovered between respect and regret. His silence was telling. It was no longer the silence of neutrality but of realization, a quiet acknowledgement that he had allowed injustice to seep into his courtroom unchecked. His authority, once unquestioned, was now overshadowed by the authority that the man had carried with him all along. For the first time since he had walked through those doors, the power in the room shifted. It was no longer held by those who questioned him, mocked him, and doubted him. It belonged to him, the man who had endured their contempt with patience, who had responded to every insult with composure, who had turned their sneers into silence. The phone call had not been a show of defiance, it had been a revelation, a reminder that prejudice thrives only until truth is revealed. The tension was almost unbearable. People cleared their throats, shuffled their papers, shifted their feet, anything to mask their discomfort. But no amount of movement could erase the reality that had settled over the courtroom: they had judged him wrong. They had taken one look at his skin and written a story in their heads, a story that painted him as unworthy, unqualified, undeserving. And now that story lay in ruins at their feet, replaced by a truth so powerful it could not be ignored. The man himself sat as he always had, calm, composed, unshaken. He did not gloat, did not revel in their shame. His silence was stronger than any lecture, his steady gaze more commanding than any raised voice. The courtroom had been turned inside out, its arrogance dismantled, its bias exposed. Those who had laughed could no longer smile, those who had doubted could no longer speak, and those who had disrespected could no longer hold his gaze. One phone call had rewritten the narrative, and the weight of that truth pressed down on every person present. The silence that followed stretched into something heavier than words. The courtroom, once a stage for mockery and doubt, now sat in the grip of an unspoken acknowledgement. No one dared to meet his eyes for long, those who had ridiculed him moments earlier seemed to shrink under the weight of their own shame. The officials, who had worn arrogance like armor, sat slumped in their chairs, their pens idle, their questions abandoned. Their power had slipped away the moment the truth surfaced, and no performance of authority could reclaim it. The proof of who he was, of what he represented, had left them with nothing to stand on. His composure had not wavered from the first step into the courtroom to this moment. Every question they hurled at him, every attempt to reduce him, had been met with the same calm discipline. Now that discipline was not just a defense, it was a mirror, reflecting back the smallness of their prejudice. They had tried to belittle him, but instead, they had belittled themselves. The phone call had not been about spectacle, it had been about truth, undeniable and absolute. Truth that silenced arrogance. Truth that demanded respect. The jurors leaned back in their seats, their earlier skepticism replaced by uneasy admiration. Some shifted as though wanting to apologize without words, others avoided his gaze entirely, unwilling to confront the guilt stirring inside them. The whispers that had carried doubt were gone, now the air was thick with a silence that spoke louder than any accusation. Even the spectators who had indulged in quiet laughter now sat frozen, their faces pale with the realization of what they had witnessed. They had been complicit in prejudice, and now they had been exposed to themselves. The judge, who had let the questioning spiral unchecked, finally cleared his throat, though his voice caught slightly before he spoke. His authority, once commanding, now faltered beneath the presence of the man before him. For the first time, he addressed him not with skepticism, but with caution, as though every word had to be chosen carefully. Respect was no longer optional, it had been demanded by truth, not by force, but by the undeniable weight of integrity. The gavel that had been a symbol of judgment now felt redundant, overshadowed by the quiet dignity of the man who had endured more than the courtroom had any right to impose. The prosecutors scribbled on their papers, pretending to find relevance where none existed, their faces flushed with discomfort. Their questions, sharp and mocking before, now hung unanswered, abandoned in the air. They had been eager to trap him, to corner him, to strip him of credibility, but instead, they had been stripped of their own. Their silence was not a choice, it was the only option left when arrogance collapsed under truth. He sat still, his hands folded neatly, his gaze steady, his breathing calm. He had no need to speak further, no need to explain or justify. The proof of who he was had spoken louder than any argument could. His integrity had been questioned, torn apart, doubted with every sneer and every laugh, but now it stood unshaken, untouchable. His very presence had become the evidence that silenced the room. The dignity they had tried to strip from him was the dignity that now towered over them, leaving them small in comparison. There was a heaviness in the room, the kind that follows when truth collides with prejudice and exposes its hollowness. No one could deny what had just happened, no one could erase the reality they had witnessed. They could not take back their laughter, their doubt, their arrogance, but they could no longer deny him the respect they had withheld. The courtroom, which had begun as a place of humiliation, had transformed into a place of revelation. They had seen the strength of a man they had dismissed, and now they sat in silence, carrying the weight of their own regret.